Imagine being told your whole life that you are Native American. Your family said it. Your grandparents lived it. Maybe a DNA test even waved a little percentage in your face and said, "Congrats." Then one day, you try to make it official, and the government looks at you and says, "You're not native enough." Not because you don't know the culture, not because your community doesn't recognize you, but because your name isn't on a list created over 100 years ago. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Native American identity in the United States was never just about ancestry. It was shaped by paperwork, politics, and control. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the U.S. government created documents like the Dawes Rolls lists meant to record native people so land could be divided, taxed, and ultimately taken. Enrollment was rushed. Names were misspelled. Entire families were left out. Children were recorded separately. Some people avoided registration out of fear. Others were denied because officials didn't believe they looked native enough. That piece of paper law, incomplete and deeply political, became the foundation for who would be legally recognized as native forever. Fast forward to today. Most tribes require lineal descent from someone on those original rolls. DNA tests don't count. Family stories don't count. Cultural participation doesn't count. If the paperwork says no, the answer is no. This has real consequences. No tribal enrollment means no voting rights within the tribe. No access to certain health care, education programs, or land rights. And perhaps the most painful part, being told your identity is invalid by a system that helped erase it in the first place. So when people argue over blood quantum or percentages, they're often debating rules created by outsiders, not native nations themselves, but a colonial system designed to shrink native populations on paper. And yes, it gets even more complicated. We're going there. If this already feels uncomfortable, good. That means you're paying attention. Before we continue, do the historical thing. Subscribe so this doesn't disappear, like so many records did. Hit like so the algorithm doesn't pretend this conversation never existed. And drop a comment because identity shouldn't be decided in silence. Let's talk about who really gets to decide who you are. Before the US government showed up with forms, stamps, and rules, native identity wasn't a percentage. It wasn't written on paper. It wasn't a number to be calculated. You belonged because your community said you belonged. You learned your place not from a document, but from the people around you, your family, your elders, your neighbors. Identity came from language, culture, and responsibility. Who you served, how you contributed, and the relationships you nurtured mattered far more than anything a bureaucrat could write down. In traditional native communities, your value wasn't measured in fractions of blood or percentages of ancestry. It was measured in actions. Could you hunt or farm? Could you honor the traditions of your people? Could you care for the young and the elderly? That was your identity. That was your proof. Nobody asked, "What fraction are you?" an elder might say. They asked, "Who raised you? Who do you serve?" Take the Cherokee, for example. Before European and later US interference, anyone adopted into a family, even through marriage or extended kinship, could fully participate in tribal life. Acceptance by the community mattered more than a single ancestor's name or a genetic test. Among the Lakota, children learned their identity through ceremony and daily practice by following the responsibilities given to them by their elders. Your place in society, not your paperwork, defined who you were. This was a living, breathing identity passed from one generation to the next. Stories, songs, dances, rituals, and responsibilities carried the weight of belonging. There was accountability and recognition, but it wasn't abstracted, it was human. The shift came with colonial policies, treaties, and eventually the Dawes Rolls in the late 1800s. Suddenly, the U.S. government insisted that identity could be quantified, catalogued, and limited. Elders who had raised children for decades suddenly saw their families' belongings reduced to numbers on a page. A person who had lived as a full member of a tribe could be told they weren't enrolled, weren't native enough, and that their identity didn't matter, at least in the eyes of the law. Before paperwork, identity was lived, not measured. It was about love, responsibility, and community. That human truth survives, even when the paper says otherwise. So as we move forward in this story, remember, Native identity was never meant to be fractions, forms, or blood quantum. It was a life fully lived. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, Native identity suddenly became a problem, at least in the eyes of the U.S. government. Why land? Money, control. The more land settlers wanted, the less convenient it was to have people recognized as Native Americans. Tribes were sovereign, yes, but treaties promised rights, land, and protections. And every recognized Native counted, every unrecognized Native didn't. So the government's solution was subtle but ruthless. Control who counts as Native. Identity became a tool, not a truth. Native people were suddenly asked to prove what had always been obvious. They belonged to their communities, lived their cultures, raised their families. Now they had to show paperwork, names, and lineage. Take the treaties of the era. Many promised land, annuities, or legal protections, but only to those officially recognized. The Dawes Rolls, created at the turn of the 20th century, were meant to catalogue Native Americans to divide communal lands. Families who had lived in a tribe for generations found themselves excluded because of clerical errors, misunderstandings, or sheer bias. Entire households vanished from the record, not because they weren't native, but because it was convenient for the government. Fewer recognized Native people meant fewer legal obligations. Funny how identity suddenly became confusing right when land was involved, an elder might note dryly. By controlling identity, the government controlled land, resources, and wealth. It was no longer a question of belonging. It was a question of profit. And Native communities had no say in the process. Decisions were imposed from outside, often by officials who had never lived in the communities they were judging. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a power play disguised as law. Families were split on paper. People who had lived as full members of their tribes were told they weren't native enough to inherit land, vote in tribal elections, or access promised services. Legal recognition became a weapon, and the very definition of native was shifted to suit colonial interests. The irony is sharp and bitter. The cultures, families, and communities that had sustained native identity for centuries was suddenly deemed insufficient not because of anything they did, but because outsiders wanted what they lived on. So as we move forward, remember, controlling identity was never about culture, it was about control. Land, money, power, and the effects of those choices echo even today. Then came something even more unsettling. The government introduced a formula, not a cultural test, not a language test, not a community vote, a fraction. It was called blood quantum. The idea was simple. Measure how much native blood a person had. 1/2 native, 1/4 native, 1/8 native. And if your fraction fell below a certain number, legally you were no longer native. Let's pause for a second. This fraction system wasn't originally created for human identity. It had already been used in livestock breeding, categorizing animals by bloodlines to track traits and ownership. That same logic was later applied to Native Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially during and after the Dawes Act period. Identity became arithmetic. On paper, it looked administrative, organized, scientific. But the math had consequences. Here's how it works. If a person who is full-blood native has a child with someone who is not, the child becomes 1/2. If that child does the same, the next generation becomes 1/4, then 1/8. Every generation, the fraction shrinks. But here's the part no one says out loud. Your culture doesn't shrink. Your language doesn't shrink. Your community ties don't shrink. Only the number does. Think about this: every generation, your blood fraction gets smaller, even if your culture stays the same. Blood quantum policies were later adopted by some tribes under federal pressure, tying legal recognition, land rights, and federal benefits to these fractions. On paper, this system guarantees something very specific. Over time, fewer and fewer people will qualify as legally native. Not because communities disappear, not because culture dies, but because math says so. It's a slow administrative vanishing. A population can be thriving in real life, raising children, practicing traditions, preserving language, and still be shrinking on government records. And when legal recognition disappears, so do treaty obligations, federal responsibilities, and access to resources tied to that status. That's the quiet danger. Blood quantum wasn't designed to strengthen native nations. It created a timeline where, eventually, the numbers run out. A system that measures identity in fractions doesn't preserve a people. It calculates their expiration date. And that's where this story becomes more than history. Because the math is still being debated today, in the late 1800s, the United States government made a decision that would quietly shape native identity for generations. They said, essentially, let's make a list of who counts as native. That list became known as the Dawes Rolls. On the surface, it sounded administrative, organized, official. In reality, it was part of the Dawes Act of 1887, a law designed to break up tribal land into individual allotments and open surplus land to white settlers. But before land could be divided, the government needed names. So federal agents traveled into native territories and began recording people family by family, name by name. And that's where the problems began. Names were misspelled by English-speaking clerks who didn't understand native languages. Ages were guessed. Family relationships were misunderstood. Some people were recorded under the wrong category. Others were labeled freedmen, descendants of formerly enslaved people held by tribes, separating them from by blood categories. Some were marked mixed. Some were excluded entirely, and some native people refused to enroll at all. Why? Because signing meant accepting U.S. authority over their identity and land. It meant participating in a system many did not trust. Some avoided registration out of fear. Some protested. Some simply weren't home when agents came through. But here's the hard truth. If your ancestor wasn't written down correctly, your descendants may be legally invisible today. Many tribes now require proof of descent from someone listed on those original Dawes Rolls to qualify for enrollment. That means one spelling error, one missed name, one refusal to sign. One biased decision by an agent over a century ago can still affect families right now. Think about that. A single moment in 1901 can determine whether someone in 2026 is legally recognized as native. The Dawes Rolls were never just a list. They became a gate. A gate that decides access to tribal citizenship, voting rights, certain benefits, and recognition. And the most unsettling part? The people who created the list were not members of the communities they were defining. History often feels distant, but sometimes it's just a name written or not written on a page. And that page still matters. Fast forward to today. You're at home. You order a DNA kit online. A few weeks later, the results pop up on your screen. 12% Native American. It feels validating, maybe even emotional. A family story confirmed, a missing piece found. But then comes the reality check. You contact a tribe for enrollment, and they say no. Not because they doubt your ancestry. Not because they're dismissing your family history, but because DNA is not citizenship. Here's the part that confuses people. Tribes are not racial categories. They are sovereign nations. That distinction changes everything. A DNA test measures genetic markers. It estimates where your ancestors may have lived thousands of years ago. It compares your sample to reference populations. It gives percentages. But citizenship in a tribe isn't based on broad genetic regions. It's based on political and legal belonging, usually documented descent from someone already recognized in that specific tribal nation. Think about it this way. Having Italian DNA doesn't automatically make you a citizen of Italy. Having 12% Irish ancestry doesn't give you voting rights in Dublin. The same principle applies here. Most tribes require proof of lineal descent from someone listed on historical rolls like the Dawes Rolls or other tribal records. Some use blood quantum. Others require documented ancestry without fractions. But almost none rely on commercial DNA tests. Why? Because accepting DNA alone would mean letting private companies define tribal citizenship. And that would undermine tribal sovereignty, the right of native nations to determine their own membership. DNA shows ancestry. It does not establish political belonging. And this is where emotions rise. People feel rejected, angry, confused. I have native blood. Why doesn't that count? Because identity, in this context, is not just biology. It's law, it's governance, it's nationhood. And tribes, after centuries of having identity defined by outsiders, now guard the right to define it themselves. That tension between ancestry and citizenship is real. But it's not about denying heritage. It's about protecting sovereignty. And that distinction matters more today than ever. Because in the end, this isn't just about percentages. It's about who has the authority to decide who belongs. Lower your voice for this part, because this is where it stops being about paperwork and starts being about people. When identity is controlled by fractions and forms, something deeper happens. Families get split not physically, but legally. One sibling qualifies for enrollment. Another does not. Same grandparents, same upbringing. Different numbers on paper. Over time, that divide can grow. One child grows up inside the legal boundaries of a tribe eligible to vote, access services, inherit certain rights. Another grows up outside those boundaries, told they are not enough by a system built generations before they were born. And when that message repeats long enough, something dangerous begins to take root. Doubt. Colonization didn't just take land. It taught people to doubt who they are. For over a century, native identity was defined by outsiders, measured, recorded, categorized, limited. Even when tribes regained the authority to define their own citizenship, they were doing so inside a framework shaped by federal policies like the Dawes Act and blood quantum rules. The structure remained, and structure's shape lives. When identity becomes a gate, belonging becomes conditional. You are no longer simply part of a community because you live it, serve it, and grow within it. You must qualify, prove, document. Some people grow up hearing family stories about their native ancestry, participating in culture, honoring traditions only to discover later that legally they don't count. That gap between lived identity and legal identity can be painful, not because culture disappears overnight, but because recognition carries power, political rights, resources, representation, protection of treaty obligations. When fewer people are recognized on paper, fewer people are counted in law. And when you are not counted, your voice becomes easier to ignore. This is the real danger, not just shrinking numbers, not just fractions, but the slow normalization of the idea that belonging must be approved, that identity must pass inspection, that community is secondary to documentation. And when people are taught to question their own legitimacy, the damage goes beyond land. It reaches into memory, into family, into self-worth. That is the part history books don't always measure, but communities feel it. And the conversation isn't over because the gate still stands. Let's be clear. This isn't about blaming tribes. Tribal nations didn't create the cage. They didn't invent blood quantum or the Dawes Rolls. They didn't impose enrollment requirements on their own communities for fun or control. These systems were forced on them by the United States government, designed to divide, reduce, and manage native populations. Tribes inherited structures meant to weaken them, and over time, some of those same systems became part of tribal governance, not as a choice of oppression, but as a tool for survival. Why do tribes still use these systems today? Because sovereignty comes with responsibility. Resources are limited. Federal recognition, land rights, healthcare services, and educational benefits all hinge on legal enrollment. Tribes have to decide who qualifies for those benefits. Without clear systems, disputes could threaten the very stability of the nation. It's a delicate balance, protecting heritage, culture, and political authority, while operating inside frameworks imposed by colonization. Tribal enrollment systems are about safeguarding identity, not erasing it. They ensure that benefits reach members who are recognized legally and historically. They maintain continuity in communities that have endured centuries of external attempts to erase them. As one elder put it, tribes didn't create the cage, they're surviving inside it. It's a survival strategy, not a moral failing. This is the nuance history books often skip. It's why conversations about identity, recognition, and sovereignty can feel so complex. Understanding this allows us to see tribes not as gatekeepers acting arbitrarily, but as nations navigating centuries of imposed restrictions, protecting their people and culture under difficult circumstances. And it reminds us, identity isn't just personal, it's political, legal, and historical. Let's slow this down. After blood quantum, after the Dawes Rolls, after DNA kits and enrollment forms, here's the uncomfortable truth. Governments have spent over a century trying to define native identity using paperwork, census rolls, fraction charts, enrollment numbers, signatures on federal forms. But culture didn't start in a filing cabinet. Long before the United States existed, native nations already knew who belonged. Identity was based on kinship, responsibility, language, shared history, and community recognition, not percentages. Then colonization introduced a different logic. If you can measure a people, you can manage them. If you can register them, you can reduce them. If you can limit who counts, you limit who receives land, protection, and resources. That's not theory. That's policy history. And yet, here's what makes this powerful. Culture survived anyway. Languages are being revived. Ceremonies continue. Tribal governments operate. Sovereign nations still negotiate with the federal government. Communities still know their own. So now we arrive at the real question. If identity can be erased by paperwork and culture can survive without federal recognition, who really decides who you are? Is it a document? A DNA result? A government roll from 1906? Or a living community that carries memory forward? History isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets counted, who gets recognized, who gets resources, who gets erased. And that question isn't just native history. It's about power. Because the authority to define identity has always been one of the strongest tools any government holds. And maybe the deeper lesson is this. When identity becomes political, survival becomes resistance. That's not just the past. That's today.